that this Thursday is what should be Canada Day, except it's going to be cancelled in a lot of places for, I think at this point, pretty self-evident reasons, probably the ongoing genocide. So because of that, I've decided to do a different Canada Day celebration than one might think. Me and Thought Slime are going to combine to do a charity stream on Thursday for the Residential School Society survivors. We're going to try and raise some funds for the survivors of residential schools because, again, they're being fought in court, effectively by Justin Trudeau. He spent over $100 million trying to fight survivors in court, which is super, super fucked up. So, yeah, I think now would be an amazing time to do that. Yes, Mildred will be there. It'll be Mildred and the Serfs, as well as a whole bunch of Indigenous content creators. You might know Tale of Two Rabbits, Agent Indian is going to be there, Lost is going to be there as well as Conquest of Dread. So I'm going to be pulling in a whole bunch of Indigenous content creators as well to highlight their stories. Working right now to get a representative from the Residential School Survivor Society to come on as well. And it's going to be awesome. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be starting at 4 p.m. on Thursday. We're going to try and run it until like 9 p.m., maybe a little bit later, and give everyone an opportunity to have some fun. And instead of celebrating Canada Day, we can fundraise a whole bunch of money for residential school survivors, which I think is a much better way to spend the holiday. So I just wanted to give everyone a quick introduction to what my Twitter notifications have looked like for the past 48 hours.
Clear! Clear.
Yeah, that's quite literally it. That's what it's been like for the past 24 or 48 hours. It's been about 2 days. I'm sure you've been following the story so far, obviously involving the newly discovered children at yet another residential school, a graveyard of unmarked graves, intentionally in order to further erase the children from history. Very, very dark. And obviously this spurned the arc with myself arguing with Destiny over whether or not Canada's actions constitute a genocide. And that ballooned into multiple other figures, shall we say, trying to take some swipes. Now, of the two bigger ones, which I knew this was going to be a matter of time, is, of course, good old classic actual justice warrior, Sean Fitzgerald, who tweets, "Imagine being this excited over finding dead native kids near a school founded in the late 1800s. The white guilt is strong with this one." Of course, I respond, "The last residential school closed in 1996. I wonder if you think founded and closed are the same word. I said founded. You just responded with closed. As in, this isn't a long forgotten part of our history from the 1800s. It's a very recent event, and the bodies of the children are just now being uncovered. The point of my tweet was that it's widely recognized as an ongoing tragedy by multiple organizations and the Prime Minister. Am I supposed to pretend abusive orphanages are unusual? Should I say that child abuse is bad? Is that the low level we're at? The Scottish found 400 bodies at Samillam Park Orphanage. You're going to virtue signal about that? No, because this is about you signaling your virtue." And then, lo and behold, in comes Ancient Indian, lances Metis. He's not allowed to care about his own people's genocide without being accused of virtue signaling. What the fuck? LMAO. Look up Metis. So this turned into just an awesome back and forth, with a lot of different accounts jumping in. I think Agent Indian kind of like sounded the banner just by jumping in here and doing some tweets, because it was wild. Normally, when I have back and forth with Sean online, I just stop typing because it's always so incredibly bad faith that I was like, what am I doing? What is the point of this? We're just going down a rabbit hole right now. We're just screaming past each other, trying to like make our points be heard. But it was a great back and forth, right? He said, look up Metis, It says, I know what I'm talking about. If you're familiar with the Métis Nation, I am Sean, then you should just have no problem making up your own arguments for yourself instead of just saying, look up Métis, as if that's somehow supposed to kind of make a point. He responds with, we actually did a while ago, when something pointed out that claims of being Métis in Canada exploded post-laws, exempting them all from kinds of permits and rules. I'm Sean. You accuse Lance of caring about residential schools and Indigenous genocide because he wants to signal his virtue. I responded by telling you that he's Indigenous. He has every reason to care about this besides virtue signaling. Like, if Indigenous people can't even care about their own genocides without being dismissed as virtue signaling, then who can care about the genocides? Like, what kind of nonsense is this? This is a one long virtue signal. I never said natives couldn't care about anything, nor that I say it was controversy, nor that I say that it was surviving family members weren't owed justice. Funny how you make up things and attribute them to me. I love that someone responded to is like, look up Métis as, oops, looks like you tweeted this note to self. That's a good rip. That's a good back and forth. Now, I did the Twitter thing. I had a very, very mad and angry tweet queued up. I was ready to launch. I was ready to just put AJW on blast, at which point I'm sure he would have put me on blast and we would have gone back and forth, just blasting all over the place, you know? Nothing actually being accomplished in the process. But then I went a little bit more serious and I just wanted to explain the situation to him. There have been controversies involved unauthorized organizations issuing Métis status. Métis people are recognized under the Constitution Act as Indigenous. There are provincially approved ones that trace family lineage and issue Indigenous status cards, of which I'm a member. So, actual justice warrior is not entirely wrong here. And oh man, I'm probably already, I'm right now in the middle of a video being made on me, aren't I? Like the screen is slowly zooming in on my head, and I'm in the corner now. Probably just do it for him. There you go. Okay, saved you time. I mean, it's a bit of a jump cut, but it'll save you time when you have to do that whole thing. Anyways, he's actually entirely right in the fact that there's been a lot of controversy in Canada involving Métis people, especially the fact that there's a bunch of organizations that just started popping up all over the place to try and grant certification for Métis status without having to do any due diligence. People could just self-declare that they are Métis and then they wanted to get recognized as that. And I think a lot of that has to do with a couple of reasons. One, racism. Racism is one of the reasons, because they think that they're going to have some kind of incredible exemptions as a result of getting an Indigenous status card. There's a big racist belief that if you have an Indigenous status card in Canada, you don't pay taxes, as in every Indigenous person doesn't pay taxes or something. That is a lie. That is completely a lie. That is if you live on a reserve. And trust me, if you live on a reserve in Canada, the conditions there are so deplorable that taxes are the least of your worries. You're not thinking about taxes when you don't have clean drinking water. So that's just a non-starter. As someone who does have status symbol, I have Indigenous status in Canada. You get the ability to hunt without a license, I think, which I don't hunt, so that doesn't really do anything for me. And then the other thing is that there are certain stores, they have to be Indigenous owned, where you won't pay provincial sales tax, but those stores are very few and far between. You mostly have to go to the interior to find them. AKA, I don't have a status card because I wanted to get cheap shit. I have one because I wanted to have my lineage verified by a provincially authorized institution. And it was really neat because they actually go down your entire family tree. And then that's how we got to discover how many relatives we had on my mom's line that go all the way back to people who spoke Cree, which is really, really cool. And on top of that, it also certifies you as a member of the BC Métis Federation, which I thought would be also very fun. And then you get to go to meetings, you get to go to potlucks, you get to do all this kind of community stuff. And then I've become somewhat disillusioned with the organization as of yet. I'm actually thinking of transferring to a different one, just because of their kind of dubious ties around pipelines. It's been a whole thing. But anyways, don't want to get into all that. All I wanted to do here was basically just explain that yes, this is entirely a situation that happens, but I happen to be not a part of that whole fiasco, just so you know. But then I think I got the closest thing that I've ever had to an apology by actual justice warrior ever. And I mean, it's as close as you'll ever get, and it's certainly in his cadence. Let's just say that it's written as nicely, I think, as he could have worded it. You know what, Lance? This only leads to mutual competing idiocy, where we end up 23andMeing each other. You're not running for president like Elizabeth Warren. I don't care about your heritage, so I shouldn't have even pushed you to defend it. So that is, I guess, the closest thing, the closest thing I've had to acknowledgement of some kind. It's still super, super sketchy and yikes. Because again, Elizabeth Warren is kind of a racist. She's kind of a racist who gave in to a much bigger racist callouts of her. And she did acknowledge that there was an article that wrote that she was the first woman of color to graduate from Harvard, which is weird. She also wrote that book, was it Kung Pao Chow, which is supposed to be a book of ceremonial indigenous recipes, which is pretty yikesy. And then she went through that whole ordeal of actually getting DNA tested, and it turned out that she was like 1/1000th Cherokee, like 1/1000th. Like, why would you do that? If that was going to be the results, I don't know why you would have went down that road. And B, why did you publish it as if it was something to be proud of, as if that was a gotcha? You done played yourself, because Donald Trump was being a huge racist when he called you Pocahontas all the time, but you don't have to validate that by kind of showing that it's kind of ridiculous to even refer to yourself as indigenous, like a gotcha. Powwow Chow, thank you, that's what it was, Powwow Chow. I think I pulled up Powwow Chow on the stream before. Oh, this one might get me roasted. Here it is. That's it, Powwow Chow. Mexican oatmeal soup. Elizabeth Warren. Cherokee. So she didn't publish the book, but she contributed to it. And she added this recipe, being, again, Cherokee, that she felt it was okay. Toast the oats in a heavy skillet over medium heat, stirring frequently until they are brown but not burnt. Set aside, melt butter in a large pot, add the onions, stir in soft, then add the remaining ingredients, including the browned oats. Boil for 6 minutes over medium heat. Serve hot. The soup sounds weird, but everyone who tries it loves it. It is rich, hearty, and interesting. It makes a great lunch or good dinner companion or something not too filling. Mexican oatmeal soup. Well, there it is. Christina, thank you for subscribing to Tier 1. Appreciate it. Oh, and what up, Casey? Everyone go check out Casey Explosion's channel. She's pretty based. I mean, I'm sure it's delicious, but also this whole thing is incredibly racist. But anyways, big shouts to Agent Indian, because his putting on blast is what brought a lot of people to this thread, and brought a lot of people argumenting, and obviously some in average faith, some in horrible faith. I will say this, and I get a lot of flack for saying this out loud, but I'm going to stand by it. I have had right now, obviously, two different pools of people, because after AJW, a new challenger approaches, after Actual Justice Warrior came in, so did Nuance Bro. So I'm going to get to Nuance Bros in a second. But obviously, there's a whole bunch of people from their communities now just duking it out in the Twitter comments, as is the drama on the Twitters. The comments I was getting from Destiny's community, overwhelmingly, and I'm saying this in complete honesty, were very good faith for the most part. Even if it was hundreds of comments that were pushing back on it, they weren't rejecting the premise that the residential school system of Canada was itself a genocide. Whereas Actual Justice Warriors and Nuance Bros fans were doing not only that, but taking things to very racist extremes, where, like, you would have, and this is not reflective of them, this is just reflective of the people who were in these threads, but then you would get comments along the lines of, like, the women, the reason that so many kids are taken away from Indigenous people is because they're all on meth, or they're all drunk. That's the reason, shit like that. So there is definitely a big difference between trying to teach liberals about these issues than trying to teach conservatives about these issues. And honestly, liberals are more willing to learn and listen, I have found, than conservatives, who have taken a much more decided, like, rah stance is probably the medical term I could put for this. The closest I could see. Your Twitter managed to give me a lot of accounts I could block. Oh, well then, yes, I've served my purpose. Excuse me. And then Nuance Bro enters the fray. This is disgusting. Imagine trying to weaken the term genocide in order to claim Canada is currently committing an ongoing genocide, gross, rendering the words meaningless. Then I said the government of Canada, including the Prime Minister of this country, calls it a genocide, as have numerous international organizations, United Nations Security Council, Amnesty International. I provided linked sources. Genocide denial, bro. Trudeau admits he's committing genocide. Does he say he should have tried it at The Hague as well? Read the source you just quote tweeted, genocide denial, bro. Yeah, I was just going to keep repeating that. Calling something an ongoing tragedy doesn't mean that it's happening and it is an act of genocide. This is so dishonest. If Trudeau was presiding over an act of genocide and admitting it, then you could persecute him at the ICC. And then he didn't even read the whole quote, so I wanted to put it out for him. Or, read the whole quote. Quote from Justin Trudeau: "We accept the finding that this was genocide and we will move forward to end this ongoing national tragedy." Yes. It would seem that the Prime Minister of Canada accepts it, but everyone else doesn't, which is odd to see. So he then tweeted, "If you think Trudeau is carrying out an ongoing genocide against natives right now, that apparently makes you genocide denier. Yet another reminder that nobody should pay attention to these internet leftist ass clowns," which is rich because I don't pay attention to nuance, bro. He just pops up in like every tweet I ever make. He's just like, he's a reply guy all the time when I make tweets with like whataboutism, not understanding the topic, just spouting out facts. Like that's consistently what it is. But sure, yeah, like I would love to be ignored. Please ignore me. I welcome it. Like, ignore me for now. I would love it. But anyways, I said, no, you rejecting the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the UN Human Rights Council, multiple government assessments, Amnesty International, the UNDRIP recommendations, that's the recommendations that came from the United Nations that they've been demanding that Canada follow for a while now. We just finally did it. And the history of the residential school system is what does it. Trudeau at least acknowledges it, which is true. Trudeau at least acknowledges it. A Big Ugly Jim, thanks for subscribing to Tier 1. Now, I'm surprised that this wasn't thrown in my face because it would have been a very easy Google search for any of these people to do. But the official policy of the Liberal government of Canada is not to label this as an ongoing genocide. That has been the words uttered by numerous politicians, including the Prime Minister of Canada. But obviously, the Liberal government of Canada has not officially made a statement or a proclamation that we, the Liberal Party of Canada, feel like this is an ongoing genocide. That is not something that they have publicly stated as part of their party platform or as one of their recommendations. They have fulfilled the charge of creating the Truth and Reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which ultimately was, I believe it was $93 million. It interviewed thousands and thousands of Indigenous survivors, hundreds of academics, hundreds of experts, numerous people who work in the field of understanding crimes against humanity, stuff of that nature. And they ruled unequivocally that it is a genocide and that it is ongoing. So that was the results and findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of which they put forward over 200 proposals to end the ongoing genocide of Canada. Those 200 proposals have not been met. So that's where that is basically left. This is combined with the fact that right now, of course, we are finding more and more of these unmarked graves of children. And that is obviously bringing up a whole bunch of sadness and trauma and triggering any survivors who have basically lived with this their entire lives, many of whom were told that these kids ran away for whatever reason. So obviously it's been absolutely devastating for the Indigenous community. That being said, one of the things that I didn't talk about, and I should have talked about, is the laws of the land. Because if I want to bring up the fact that the genocide itself is ongoing, we have to talk about the Indian Act of Canada. The Indian Act of Canada is still enshrined into Canadian law, as in it is still codified. It is part of the law of Canada. The Indian Act of Canada did a lot of things. Here's the things that most people don't know it did. It denied women's status. And I'm not talking about status as a Canadian. I'm talking about status overall. They weren't allowed to be tribal leaders. They weren't allowed to be tribal councillors. They weren't allowed to be they weren't allowed to vote. But at that time, no Indigenous people were allowed to. But it eventually stripped women of their status, even amongst Indigenous communities. Sienna, 2002. Thanks. It introduced the residential school system, which I'm sure by now everyone probably understands. I've explained it multiple times. This was a system in which children were taken from their families, forcibly put into these institutions where they were beaten, raped, tortured. On the most positive aspects of these schools was that it was effectively trying to erase their culture. It would do so by erasing their Indigenous language. It would do so by erasing their Indigenous names, by erasing their Indigenous religions, stories, spirituality. It would then give them proper Western names, proper Catholic names. It would make them forget everything about their families. The idea was to effectively destroy the culture and turn them into white people. That was it. They were white people indoctrination schools. And these are the same schools where, again, the children were tortured, beaten, and raped. We are now discovering these mass graves, and these are decades later. So decades later, after the parents of these kids were told that they had run away, we are now uncovering the fact that they, in fact, were mass buried underground near the schools. They created the reserve system of Canada. The reserve system of Canada, which still exists today, is basically trying to take a whole bunch of indigenous cultures and squish them into one small little area that has inadequate sewage, inadequate water, and as a result of such, what a surprise. All these people who were different tribes and cultures, all these people who had different languages, different history, different spirituality, all being forced to live in very small contained areas that did not have adequate food, adequate water, adequate, just quality of life. Yes, they started to perpetually have incredibly high rates of alcoholism, incredibly high rates of suicide, incredibly high rates of domestic abuse, incredibly high rates of crime. All of this perpetuates generation after generation. These same systems exist today, and in the current paradigm that we have ourselves, they don't have clean drinking water still. So even under the purview of our, woke Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, 53 of the reserves in Canada do not have clean drinking water. As in, if you live there, you cannot drink the water that comes out of the taps. So best you find another source. They renamed individuals with European names. They restricted First Nations from leaving the reserve without permission. They enforced enfranchisement of any First Nation admitted to university. They could expropriate portions of reserves for roads, railways, or other public works, as well as move an entire reserve away from a municipality if it was deemed expedient. So basically what they would do is they would create these reserves, and then they would be temporary holding centers for the indigenous problem. And then while these reserves were in effect in one area and people might have become a little bit established, they then could decide if they wanted to build a railway or like an entire municipality around it, at which point the reserves could be just taken and then shackled and moved somewhere else. So effectively displacing them a second time, and that happened frequently. They could lease out uncultivated reserve lands to non-First Nations if the leaseholder would use it for farming or pasture. It forbade First Nations from forming political organizations, prohibited anyone First Nations or non-First Nation from soliciting funds from First Nation legal claims, prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations, prohibited the sale of ammunition to First Nations, prohibited pool hall owners from allowing First Nations entrance inside, imposed the bound council system. That exists today, but that was not the way that Indigenous people ever governed themselves. They didn't have band councils, but Canada invented those, and those are the same systems that are used today, in which these elected leaders have to speak for entire bands at times. And again, women were not allowed to enter them. It forbade First Nations from speaking their native language. It forbade First Nations from practicing their traditional religion. It forbade Western First Nations from appearing in any public dance, show, exhibition, stampede, or pageant wearing traditional regalia. They weren't allowed to wear their clothes. They weren't allowed to, they actually literally weren't allowed to dance. They weren't allowed to hold potlucks. They weren't allowed to do anything like that. These really weird ones will get rectified in the 1950s. There has been amendments to the Indian Act. They declared the potlatch and other cultural ceremonies illegal, denied First Nations the right to vote, created the permit system to control First Nations' ability to sell products from farms, and created under British rule for the purpose of subjugating one race, the Aboriginal peoples. So this is entirely why it was codified into law, the actual laws of Canada, and why we wrote the acts of genocide into our very laws which exist to this day. The Indian Act of Canada has been, as I'm going to explain to you, revised a few times, but it's still considered the law of the land. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 laid down the basis for how colonial administrations would interact with First Nations people in the centuries that followed. The proclamation guaranteed certain rights and protections for First Nations people and established the process by which the government could acquire their lands. Further policies were passed in the first half of the 19th century that aimed to assimilate First Nations people into growing settler population. The 1850 Act, which was better known for the protections of the land and property, was one of the first pieces of legislation that included a set of requirements for a person to be considered a legal Indian, a precursor of the concept of status. These requirements were based on the blood and essentially said that the people shall be considered as Indians if they were of Indian blood and that were members of a body or tribe of Indians. This is where the whole blood quantum thing comes in, because actually the Metis people, for the large part, because they spoke fluent French, were exempt from a lot of this. They would not get status as Indigenous peoples. However, they were allowed to vote, unlike the majority of other Indigenous peoples in Canada. Whether you were Inuit, First Nations, didn't matter. You wouldn't be allowed to vote in Canadian elections, but you would, and that's why there is such a thing such as Métis privilege, because they were considered half-breeds. That was the name of them. They were obviously hugely persecuted and had a huge amount of racism poured upon them by colonizers. There was no question. All right, you have to look to the Red River Rebellion to see how intense that goes. But at the same time, the quote-unquote half-breeds were able to have more rights than their indigenous counterparts, simply by the basis of both they spoke French and they would often look like a mix of both peoples. Now, I just want to talk about the First Amendments. In 1951, there was amendments to the Indian Act. This period was immediately following the Second World War. It involved much societal introspection in Canada and led to a reconsideration of some of the more restrictive and oppressive measures imposed by the Indian Act. A series of proposed reforms were rejected or opposed by First Nations peoples because they were not involved in the process. As a result, the government of Canada broke with tradition and through the Joint Committee process consulted with First Nation communities for the first time ever about changes to the Indian Act. The resulting overhaul in 1951 removed some of the most offensive political, cultural, and religious restrictions. For example, banned on ceremonies such as the potlatch and the Sundance were removed. Communities were also able to bring about land claims. This one would be one they would come to regret, because this is the one that actually opened the doors for the land back movement against the government. For First Nations women, oh great, thanks. For First Nations women, the 1951 amendment meant that they were now able to vote in band council. So they were able to vote for the first time within their own bands. Before then, they weren't even allowed to vote within their own band council, which is just obscenely fucked. It's like, not only are we going to impose the patriarchy upon you, we're going to impose the patriarchy upon your own tribe. You know, they're called bands in Canada, but upon your own band. We're gonna go that far and do that now. However, the amendment did not rid the act of discrimination. For example, the Indian Act prohibited status people from possessing intoxicants or being intoxicated. The 1951 amendments also made the province's jurisdiction over Indigenous child welfare, where none existed federally. So the 1951 thing removed the things that were outwardly offensive on the surface, which everyone could agree, because at that point, Canadian society was becoming a little bit more woke. All right, there was the civil rights movement that was burgeoning in the United States. Canada had similar movements here. So they were like, well, we can't keep these archaic laws on the board. But at the same time, we're going to introduce Section 88, which is the section on child welfare. This is where the 60s Scoop comes from. So this is actually one of the worst parts in the Act. This allowed for the 60s Scoop to occur, a process by which provincial child welfare agencies chose to remove children from their homes rather than provide community resources and support. The 60s Scoop had considerable and long-lasting effects on Indigenous communities. Moreover, the amendments did not overturn the discriminating nature of the Indian Act. The Act itself replaced the concept of Indian blood with one of status through registration. In other words, simply having First Nation heritage was not enough to qualify for status. Yet, male lines of descent were still privileged. Women with status lost their rights if they married a non-status person. The provision also regarded a woman's status was particularly extreme. A woman's status rights flowed entirely through her husband's blood. A non-status woman who married a man with status would gain status himself. A status woman who married a status man had her band membership tied to him, so she was no longer a member of her own band, and she lost the status entirely if she was widowed or abandoned by her husband. I don't understand why, while they're doing these amendments, they just had to keep fucking over women. It's like, this shit's already bad enough, you know? The 60s coup was 100% kidnapping. That's where the largest amount of children were taken from their families. This was all done legally under the guise of child protection services at the time. So it was actually the RCMP at that point who were the ones grabbing all these children. We're talking thousands of kids removed from their families who eventually, again, were tortured, beaten, and raped in residential schools. There was demands for change multiple times. 1969, this is not going to be that nice. The government of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin's father, released its white paper, which declared its intention to entirely eliminate the Indian status and Department of Indian Affairs. The white paper was met with outrage from First Nations people and was immediately countered by the red paper, created and presented by Harold Cardinal, then president of the Indian Association of Alberta. Due to fierce and continued opposition by Indigenous groups and their supporters, the Canadian government quickly withdrew the white paper. Many Indigenous women during this time were fighting to change discriminatory sections of the Indian Act. 1985 amendments. In 1985, responding to the growing national and international concern over the lack of equality in the Indian Act, the government passed Bill C-31. The bill fully removed all remaining enfranchisement clauses. Additionally, those who had lost status through marriages were reinstated as status Indians and band members. Their children gained status but would not gain band membership for 2 years. This interval was meant to give bands time to create their own membership codes, which would exclude the children but not their mothers if such a code would not pass prior to June 1997. Still, just fucking over women and mothers. It just seems like to be a consistent pattern. However, while the amendment addressed discrimination against women, it also created some problems. Bill C-31 created 2 categories of Indian registration. The first, known as Section C-1, applies to both parents who are entitled to registration. The second, known as C-2, applies to one parent entitled to registration. Status cannot be transferred from one parent who's registered to the other, so it became what is known as the second generation cutoff rule. But this way, Bill C-31 had consequence by the number of people entitled to status rights. You might be wondering at this point, why exactly did they have such outrage at the idea of the Indian Act being repealed or the idea of status being removed, that is because none of this has become to coincide with the idea of autonomy. See, it's one thing for them to remove what little protections might be afforded to them and or oppressions might be in addition to met upon them through these acts, right? At the same time, they're not doing any kind of a land back. They're not doing any kind of well, you have authority and autonomy as a sovereign nation over your own land. No, it's basically, well, we now want you to just assimilate and be proper Canadians. The same thing you've been trying to do this whole time to very fucked up effects. So we don't want that either. Since then, there's been proposals to increase band governance. In 2002, there was another bill. It was to promote the recognition and implementation of the right to self-govern for First Nations in Canada. The bill would have allowed First Nations wishing to self-govern to develop a proposal and a constitution. It received a second reading, but it ultimately failed, so they never gained any autonomy there. There was amendments in 2011 and 2017. The Indian Act still discriminated against women and their descendants with result to status rights. 2011, Parliament passed the Gender Equity and Reservation Act, known as Bill C-3. The federal government's response to the act was about gender discrimination. However, the descendants of women, specifically great-grandchildren, did not have the same entitlements as descendants of men in similar circumstances. Therefore, Bill C-3 still denied the status rights. So not much there. There's been more proposed reforms in 2010. Anyways, long story short, there has been no major amendments to the bill that addresses any of the heinous and terrible parts of the Indian Act. Some of the worst parts of the Indian Act are still law in Canada. So a lot of these are still codified as Canadian law, which again, I keep having to reiterate this, is one of the reasons why this is pointed to by not only members of the government of Canada, numerous other organizations, as an ongoing genocide, because the Indian Act of Canada is still codified into Canadian law. That hasn't changed. If the answer, if the question you're going to be asking is what exactly could be done at this point, what do people want? In terms of Indigenous people, they want autonomy. They don't want the Indian Act to be abolished. They want it to be rendered irrelevant, as in it does not apply because there's no such things as Indians living in Canada. That's the idea. So the idea would be to A, honor the treaties that were made originally, which does give sovereign autonomy over Indigenous land. And on top of which, by doing so and giving them full autonomy and giving them land back, they would no longer have to worry about whether or not they fall under the purview of this super weird, racist, old, archaic law that we still have, you know? I live on Treaty 7 land. Oh, cool. I read up on the treaty on stream a few weeks ago. Oh, nice. Big Ugly Jim. I will follow your stream. As a Métis person, how do you feel about the NDP and their connections to provincial governments with the CCF and the NDP that oversaw the residential school system? I obviously feel conflicted in the sense that I think every single government official at some point or another has blood on their hands for the residential school system. I mean, it was run by the federal government of Canada, and that's why it was a genocide. Like, it was actively trying to destroy, erase, and cause death to Indigenous culture. That wasn't like, there was not a written part of either the Indian Act or the residential school system that said we will now exterminate Indigenous people. We will wipe them off the face of the earth, in the sense that we will literally kill them all, which is why I think so many people have trouble trying to wrap their heads around this being a genocide, because they're like, what? But Justin Trudeau doesn't wake up every morning and put on his, ceremonial headdress and then say, well, now's another day to commit genocide against the Indigenous people. No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that at all. It doesn't matter if the laws of the land, as well as a lot of the things that continue to be perpetuated by the same system, have in effect been doing a cultural genocide against a specific group of people. Like, if you look at the actual things that register as genocide under the UN Convention, one of them is the forcible displacement of people from their homes and ancestral land. And that was 100% happening. In fact, that is still happening to this day. That's still a problem, especially under the purview of the RCMP in this country.
In the northwest corner of a former residential school in Saskatchewan, a very private and sacred ceremony today for the unnamed hundreds who lie in unmarked graves. Late tonight, a vigil at the cemetery for the 751 lost souls buried here. CTV's Creason Ashkute shares some of the personal stories he was told on day 3 after the distressing discovery.
At Cowessess First Nation Cemetery, where 751 unmarked graves were discovered, now sits a lone teepee that protects the sacred fire.
The Ferret King, thank you. And to your question, it was the Catholic Church at first. So the Catholic Church ran it. It was still a law that was signed into effect under John A. Macdonald, the first prime minister of this country, as well as a proud Aryan. So like he was a white nationalist who signed the residential school system into power under the Indian Act itself. And at that time, it was supervised and run by the Catholic Church. Eventually, the government of Canada took the entire program over, and the federal government of Canada started running the residential school system. So that's when the government of Canada fully became involved in genocide.
To bring the spirits here to be with us. Now they have a home now.
Owen Delorme calls himself a spiritual man. He helped pray for the people buried here and the First Nations still in mourning. He says the fire will burn for the next 4 days, serving as a light in the dark for the spirits of the people and children.
When they were out there, there was no real home for them. They wandered here and there, like in different buildings, like how you say. Different entities would appear in these buildings here.
Delorme attended the Maryvale Residential School when he was only 6 years old. When he got out at 14, he turned to drugs and alcohol after years of pain he endured. His culture and spirituality that the schools tried to take from him would later help him heal.
Love one another, be good to one another. No matter who you are or what you are.
Grab a box.
That love was evident today as this man, Kevin Friesen, a Cowessess member, helped deliver 800 solar lights for the unmarked graves.
It was good to see the group come together. Young, old, the elders, everybody working as a team.
Lights were donated by Friesen's employer and is just one of many donations flowing into the community.
As soon as we heard they wanted to do the solar light vigil, I went to my owner. He promptly agreed to provide the lights at no cost to me. He phoned the local Canadian Tire. They emptied their shelves within hours.
Riley Delorme is part of the Cowessess Community Youth Council, a group that has been lending a hand at the cemetery.
I have a lot of family members who went to residential schools, and it's hard to take in when you have a lot of people and a lot of connections.
On the 4th day, the community will have a feast with the spirits before they are finally able to go home to the spirit world. Riley's message to them is from the heart.
I'm super glad we found you because, like I said, this is not something to be swept under the carpet. You guys were real people. You all had hearts. You all had...
What the heck is Canadian Tire? Y'all don't know about Canadian Tire? Oh, wow. Canadian Tire is like home hardware, except it's Canadian, and you can get all your car needs too. You can get your car repaired. It's like food and stuff, in that they have food and stuff. They have tons of stuff. There's so many products, so much cheap plastic shit, camping stuff too, air guns, all the heart desires. And then what they do is every time you go to Canadian Tire and you buy something, you get a whole bunch of money. You get Canadian Tire money. So your pockets fill up with these Canadian Tire bills that, of course, can only be spent and used in Canadian Tire. So you've got all these piles of bills, and each Canadian Tire bill is like 1 cent to 5 cents. They're like little 5 cent. So you'll get home if you shop at Canadian Tire frequently, and you'll just have this pile of Canadian Tire money. You're just always looking down and being like, what the fuck am I ever going to do? And then the one day you bring it all in, you're like, you know what? I did a good thing. I didn't throw them in the recycling. I spent a long time. I've shopped all year. I've spent so much money in Canadian Tire, and I've amassed Monopoly stacks, fat stacks. All right, I could make it rain Canadian Tire money when I get in there, and it's like $5.26 total for like a whole year's worth. It's like you could have a garbage bag of Canadian Tire money when you show up. No, I'm not making any of this up. Like this, it's a huge thing. Like a literal garbage bag of Canadian Tire money, and it's all just pennies. It's like having a garbage bag full of pennies. Drop it down and like, oh yeah, thanks for saving all these, eh? And coming in is very good of you. Oh yeah, you can go get yourself a hose there, hoser. Yeah, use that some of the Canadian Tire money. Thanks for shopping.
Families.
The people here say it's important to remember that the unmarked graves belong to not just residential school students, but also the people that lived and worked here in the community who are from the surrounding area. Sandy.
All right, Creason, thank you.
Okay, one last thing, and then I'm going to make an announcement.
Still searching for answers after
A
yesterday's
new book is
discovery.
out
Nola
that
Jeffrey
details the trials and triumphs of a restaurant.
No.
Is the executive director of the Sotan Laylam Society in Lanceville, British Columbia. It is a healing center that runs a support line. Nola, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Good morning.
What have the past, I guess, week or so been like in terms of the calls that you've been receiving and what people have been telling you?
Well, it's been about 3 weeks, and we have been extremely busy. Not only our support line, but the Indian Residential School line, the KUOS line. And people are hurt. There's huge, huge grief. And all the other feelings that you could imagine go with that. There's people that are angry. There's people that are, even though they knew the truth, it's still a shock to the body to find that many children.
And it's a shock, as you mentioned there, to those that have lived it, as well as to their families who are realizing what their parents or their grandparents may have gone through, many of them not feeling the strength to share these types of stories. What is it that you're trying to do to help them?
What we're trying to do is to have an open heart and an open mind, to listen from a loving place, from a caring place, to help them to ground, to process, to allow whatever they're feeling to come up and to come out, and just to be there to support them.
Mm-hmm. Hearing what they need, hearing the stories that they're telling you, or
No,
just, as you
Chico.
say, needing to have that support.
I like cutting back and forth because I think it makes it visually more interesting and it looks better for segments if I do it. But also sometimes I just want people to be able to tell their story without like my ridiculous mug in the corner. Just I look too goofy sometimes.
What you're hearing from the government, what we're hearing in some cases from the Catholic Church, is that some sense of comfort? Is that the right start they need?
No, I haven't talked about the schools burning down, which is pretty wild. Let me see if I have that story. There was Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, is now fighting tooth and nail to preserve Canada Day. He's like, his entire political party is in absolute shambles right now. And he's trying to do anything desperately to like gain attention. So right now he's saying that he's the only prime minister who is proud of Canada, and he says he still wants the country to do better. His comments come amid multiple communities canceling their Canada Day celebrations in the wake of an estimated 751 unmarked graves being found at a former Saskatchewan residential school. Discovery came just after the remains of 215 children were found at another former residential school in Kamloops. As communities' family reel from the news, some advocates have called for Canadians to hold off their fireworks and fanfare for Canada Day this year. Canada Day for a long time has been super controversial. Like I can tell you, as a 20-something-year-old who was like ashamed of my heritage because it had been so deeply ingrained in me by Canadian society, that I just love Canada Day because, you know, me and all the other frenzies, you wrap yourself up in nationalism that would be obscenely cringe if Americans were doing it. But in Canada Day, it's just colorful. Everyone paints themselves in red and white and has giant Canadian flags on their backs, you know, and drinks red flavored drinks. Well, we don't do that one as much, and then celebrates on the streets and party. It's just a massive party. It's a holiday, but unlike July 4th in America, in Canada Day, it's basically everyone just gets wasted in public, and that's been a thing. But the other aspect of it is it's also been known as Colonizer Day by Indigenous communities for a very, very long time, for obvious reasons. I mean, you're celebrating the formation of Canada, the unification of all these different provinces, and the Hudson Bay Company, which used to own a lot of Canada. We were owned by a corporation. That's how clown shoes this entire country is. We were owned by a company.
Sorry, you know, I can't answer that question for anyone. Each individual needs to answer that question for themselves. But I think the truth has to come out, and that the records have to come out, and that the support needs to be there to find all of those unmarked graves, to identify who those children are,
True,
to bring
Big
those
Papa.
children
That is true.
home to their families, and for everybody to start healing. And that's Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, that we need to walk through this together.
So I think I made a command for it. Is it survivors? Oh, Nightbot is either drunk or my command didn't work. Nightbot, Shame. Hiding people from an important charity. So what's supposed to pop up when I do that is this is supposed to pop up. Hopefully it'll start working. Anyways, that's the direct area if you want to help donate to residential school survivors, or if you want the resources to be able to buy orange shirts to show solidarity. Of course, always buy those orange shirts from Indigenous shirt makers and or artists. That's a really big thing. But I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to say that this Thursday is what should be Canada Day, except it's going to be canceled in a lot of places for, I think at this point, pretty self-evident reasons, probably the ongoing genocide. So because of that, I've decided to do a different Canada Day celebration than one might think. Me and Thought Slime are going to combine to do a charity stream on Thursday for the Residential School Society survivors. We're going to try and raise some funds for the survivors of residential schools because, again, they're being fought in court, effectively by Justin Trudeau. He spent over $100 million trying to fight survivors in court, which is super, super fucked up. So yeah, I think now would be an amazing time to do that. Yes, Mildred will be there. It'll be Mildred and the Serfs, as well as a whole bunch of Indigenous content creators. You might know Tale of Two Rabbits, Agent Indian is going to be there. Lost is going to be there as well as Conquest of Dread. So I'm going to be pulling in a whole bunch of Indigenous content creators as well to highlight their stories. Working right now to get a representative from the Residential School Survivor Society to come on as well. And it's going to be awesome. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be starting at 4 p.m. on Thursday. We're going to try and run it until like 9 p.m., maybe a little bit later, and give everyone an opportunity to have some fun. And instead of celebrating Canada Day, we can fundraise a whole bunch of money for residential school survivors, which I think is a much better way to spend the holiday. Spend it indoors, online, you know? Don't touch grass. Don't touch grass. I mean, if you are going to go outside, you should probably eat ass. Don't touch grass. Eat ass. That'll be a better use of your time. But if you don't have any ass to eat on that particular day, come swing by. It'll be good times had by all. And yeah, fuck Canada Day. And also fuck Canada.
Hey, do you like movies? Do you like Serfs? Do you want movies and Serfs watching the movies? So then come over to the new channels. It's the Serfs, the cinema. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Can you do the thing, that thumbs up and comment and all those things that help us out in the algorithm that controls every aspect of our lives? Also, if you happen to have a Facebook account, can you delete it? Like just delete it. You should probably delete your Facebook account because it's not a great company. But hey, if you can't do that for whatever reason, I understand. And could you also go to facebook.com/thesurftimes then and give us a little like and a follow. We're just trying to push back against the fact that people like Ben Shapiro happen to dominate the platform entirely. And when everyone asks why do older generations believe the things they believe, one of the problems is the majority of them on social media use Facebook. So to counter that, we're just going to be on there too now. Also, if you happen to have a union or a worker co-op or even a leftist project, podcast, website, Zoom, MySpace, it doesn't matter. We will advertise it for free on this channel. All you got to do is go to weareserfs.com and use the forms that we got there, weareserfs.com. Thanks, everybody.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and VK Jehannam, we are prepared to commit human sacrifices for your eternal glory. To our monarchs, the Tim Caucus and Tom Spiker, we are humbled to be your oafish jesters, clowning around in your royal court. To our lords, Evan Nudie, Tofox, Ryan Lubin, Trevor R., Jeff Lamb, and Alexander Thaler, we shall proudly carry your standard onto the battlefield and die for your precious land. To our esteemed Knights of the Round Table, Dark Puppy, Jenna Towell, Anna Loves Riley, Quiet 185, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojack, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, The Great Pudini, Bone Genie, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramona Costa, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jimmy Bignuts, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Yopi, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our glass, we raise our swords, and we salute you.